Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to Free Forum, a world that just might work. This episode was recorded as a Live Talks LA event, March 17th, 2025, in Los Angeles. In it, I speak with longtime political commentator Juan Williams about his latest book, New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. On Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally, all one word, terrencemcnally.net. I like folks to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the books and so on that we talk about. So, in your own words, briefly, your personal path to the work you do today. And mention mentors, turning points, that sort of thing, if you wish.
Well, let me start with this book. I mean, when you talk about something personal, I think when I was a kid, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I was born in Panama. My mom brought 3 kids to Brooklyn when I was 4 years old. So really, I don't have much experience with Panama. I don't speak Spanish, for example, something I wish I did. But I grew up in Brooklyn. And I grew up in a, obviously, black neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. And from the time I was a kid, I always had in mind the thought, why do certain people get their trash picked up? Why do certain people have better schools? Why are certain people treated as citizens while others are treated as suspects by the police? And I was editor of my junior high school newspaper. I was editor of my high school newspaper. And when I went away to college, I got a job at what was then the biggest paper in Philadelphia, then an afternoon paper, if you can believe that. Afternoon papers in America now defunct. But there was an afternoon paper that was the biggest, and they hired me even while I was at Haverford College. So for me, a lot of this comes out of personal experience, Terrence, that I want to answer these questions, and I want to have people understand how power operates in America. I want to take people behind the scenes, if you will, and get us to think about power. And in this case, nearly 40 years ago, as you said, I wrote Eyes on the Prize, which is the story of sort of what is in the American mind as the classic civil rights era. So 54, thinking in those terms, is the time of the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, landmark decision that says that segregation is, separate is not equal in terms of education in this country. To 1965, which is the time of the Voting Rights Act, and between 64, the Civil Rights Act. Fast forward to today, 2025, and I think we are in the midst of a second movement that is having more impact than the first movement, having more power in terms of the conversation, the political conversation, and having greater support from the American people than the first movement. But people don't seem to see it that way, and I think that's why this book is so important. It's to try to get people to open their eyes and say, wait a minute, there's something going on, something very important. Right now, if you tune into American politics, you know that President Trump is literally at war with something called DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And you know that so much of that conversation really has been launched in the last decade. And he is after it and saying that this is wrong. This is wrong for America. What are we talking about? We're talking about, well, is race a legitimate factor to be discussed among us? What about ethnicity? What about can you talk about these things? Can you talk about race as a factor in terms of who gets into, let's say, UCLA? Is it legitimate? Well, what about in terms of who gets hired or who gets promoted? What about what's in a curriculum, what we teach kids? So we talked about me as a kid having these questions. I can see what's going on, but is it legitimate to teach a child about the United States handling of immigrants going back to the 1800s? How about early in the 20th century in terms of the treatment of the Japanese, or how we denied entry to Jews even in the course of the Holocaust? Is it legitimate? Or what are we talking about in terms of slavery, in terms of legal discrimination, in terms of lynching and racial violence? Is that just going to make a white kid feel guilty, or is it, in fact, important part of American history that must be told? And I think we are in the midst of those discussions right now. But where does this start? I start with the election of Obama. I think it starts a little before, going back to 2004 when Obama spoke at the Democratic National Convention in Boston. I was in the room. And I can tell you, nobody knew who this guy was.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was like, well, who is the guy? And
state senator?
He was a state senator from Illinois. And the question, not elected to any national office, having been defeated in a previous run for a congressional office from a black neighborhood. So, I mean, you think, well, who is this guy? But when he starts to speak, I think all of us remember to this day what he said, which was, we are not a white America, we're not a black America, we're not an Asian America, we're not a Latino America, we're not a liberal America, we're not a conservative America, we're the United States of America. And really, what set that speech apart was when he said this. He said, my story, the son of an African immigrant to the United States and a white woman from Kansas, my story would not have been possible in any other country. And the place was, at first, as I say, people were tittering and tattering and talking, it's a convention. And then people get quiet, and then the applause starts. And then the applause gets uproarious. And you know what struck me was, I hadn't heard a black leader speak in these terms ever before. You think back to Dr. King, you come forward to people like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, like it was always in terms of black grievance and slavery and discrimination and the debt, literally the debt owed in terms of not explicitly reparations, but remediation to try to bring black people along and into the American experience. Well, here was a young, handsome man, Barack Obama, talking optimistically and opening the door to the possibility of a conversation that wasn't locked in the old tracks, but opened a new horizon to new prospects of racial progress. And when he ran for president, Terrence, his poster just said hope, right? Rainbow colors, and he looked beatific, and it was so optimistic, and it was like, oh my God, we can actually, in a more diverse America than ever, make progress. And what happens then is I think people start talking in terms of post-racial. Right. That new concept emerges, post-racial. Obama says he's not post-racial, but everybody else is talking post-racial. He gets elected president. He says he's not the black president. He's not post-racial president. He's the president of all Americans. But in that moment, everybody's thinking, wow. I remember Ebony Magazine ran a cover that said, in my lifetime, and I related to that fully. In my lifetime, we have a black president. America has changed. The racial conversation has changed. Our understanding of race is shifting. Well, then he gets into office, and immediately with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare as it was called, generates tremendous opposition. The opposition largely comes from an older white base on the Republican side, who says, why are you messing with my health insurance? You're doing it to help these working class and poor people who don't have health insurance, and they're disproportionately the blacks and the Latinos, aren't they? You're the black president. That's what's going on. And he's saying, no, this is good policy, if you'll recall. And then what happens is the emergence of Black Lives Matter. Remember Trayvon Martin's murder?
Yes.
And then comes, after that, the birther movement. Donald Trump defeating Hillary Clinton, questions about black support for her as a candidate, and then comes George Floyd. And I'll say this and then I'll get back.
Yeah.
But when people ask me, as you did right at the start, about the personal stuff, but they say, why do you say there's a rise of a second civil rights movement at this moment? And what about the first, and who's the new Dr. King? I say, well, there is no new Dr. King. This is a distinctive movement. It's built on the shoulders of the first movement, but it's not the first movement. It's not an evolution. This is a different time. And if you think back to that first movement, you think back to a highlight, which would be Dr. King in the 1963 March on Washington and his great speech, I Have a Dream, that the children of slaves and the children of slave owners can sit at the table and have honest discussion, that people will be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And it's one day in Washington, D.C., 250,000 people. After George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, there were thousands of marches all across the United States, including here in Los Angeles.
That's right. And globally.
And globally. And 26 million people just in the United States, but you could have been in Paris, you could have been in Buenos Aires, you could have been in Tokyo, and there was marching under the Black Lives Matter banner. And the conversation that started there goes on because it's so viral. It's messages, it's memes, it's tweets. Remember, there was an image of George Floyd with the policeman on his neck that convinced people of the power of the oppression taking places and then sparks the protest. All of this is distinctive from what was going on in the first movement. In the first movement, you had people like Dr. King who could set an agenda and say, we're going to have a march here, and this is to get the Civil Rights Bill passed. Well, now you have people who were, for the most part, resisting a hierarchical structure to any kind of movement. They wanted people in every community to have their own agenda. So you have things like police brutality, but you also have high rates of incarceration of black and brown people. You have income inequality. You have bad schools. It's a more diffuse agenda. And I think to some people, the lack of specific, identifiable leaders and the more diffuse agenda prevents them from saying, oh, this is a civil rights movement we're watching. Something is going on, and I better get involved.
Well, I'll jump into that because it struck me as I'm reading or listening to some of your previous interviews on the book and so on, that I think it's hard for people to recognize it as a movement because it doesn't look like a movement, right? People think of a movement as
they think of it
having
what
leaders.
They've seen before.
Yeah, exactly. And you decided, okay, it's decentralized. The people don't know the leaders of Black Lives Matter. They don't all have the same agenda. And yet to you, it said movement. What do you mean by movement in that you saw it when most others didn't? What was it? What does that definition for you of a movement that makes this a movement?
Well, I think the key here, Terrence, is the level of public support. And this is so tricky, and I think this adds to the difficulty for people to perceive the history that's being made right in front of us at this moment as we are talking here March 17, St. Patrick's Day 2025. Let's go back to what I was talking about in terms of that great March on Washington, 250,000 people, one day, August 1963. Most of the people who are in this march are black people.
That's true.
Let's fast forward to what happens after George Floyd. You might not know this, but 2/3 of the people marching are white. 2/3. The second largest group, Latinos. Now, you stop and think about this. Level of public support. Remember how we now lionize Dr. King. We have a monument, literally, his statue on the mall in Washington, D.C. But you should know Dr. King was not a popular man. And you should know that the March on Washington scared members of Congress so much that they arranged to leave town. The National Guard surrounded the city. And the buses that brought the protesters in on a Wednesday because they didn't want to risk having people stay over a weekend. So not a Monday, not a Friday, not even a Thursday, but a Wednesday. They bring people on buses in the morning and they ship them out at night. And the president, President Kennedy, had personally asked the leaders, people like Roy Wilkins, Dr. King, not to have the march. Appeal to the labor unions, to the religious leaders, to the rabbis, don't come. We don't want this trouble. The march takes place nonetheless. Now again, point of contrast. You think about the lack of public support there and the support for this movement. And I will say this. Even today, the principles, the notion of we are aware and appreciative of a struggle for racial and social, political equity in the country is higher than it was back in that 50s, 60s period. And why do I say that? Again, high level of people who actually marched, but if you even look at polls from like 23, 24, despite all the libelous comments made about Black Lives Matter by someone that we know well as our president today, he said that Black Lives Matter is a symbol of hate. He's asked that literally the letters, the name Black Lives Matter be ripped off the street in Washington.
And it was.
And it has been.
They've completed that removal of that wonderful symbol on the road.
Despite all that, you should know still more than 50% of Americans say they support the principles of Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter has had some trouble of their own, lack of transparency for huge financial donations. We're not sure what happened and all the like. But still to this day, Terrence.
The principles.
The principles are supported by a majority of Americans. And I will say this again. This is a different movement. And when I talk about public support, distinctly larger now than it was back then, and it's saying to me as a historian, observer, journalist observer of this is a different era and something's going on. Keep in mind that in that 54 to 65 period, 90% of America is white. 90%. The second largest racial group is black, about 8 or 9%.
And then just a sprinkling, 2 or 3% of everything else.
Everything else.
Including Latinos and Asians.
Right. And now this is unbelievable because, again, here we are, March of 2025, and the country is about 60% white. The second largest racial group is the Latinos at about 17 or 18%, now approaching 20. Blacks are about 12, 13%. Asians, the fastest growing minority in the country. This is a different country with different voices raising personal experiences and views. The child that I talked about being at the very start of our conversation, why do I write about this? The child that wonders why do the police treat some people as suspects and some people as citizens, well, suddenly that voice has some place and can be heard in America. And it's previously, it was drowned out. It was a conversation largely among white. Somebody said to me the other day, you know, when the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act was passed, there were no black people in the U.S. Senate.
None.
Zero.
Wow.
And it's just a reminder. We're in a different period. Different voices are being heard.
And one thing, I'm going to respond right to that. When you break down how the demographics have changed, how the population is different, I think that accounts for some of the fear that generates the grievance and backlash.
I think so. I think you're onto something. And I think that if you watched
when they were 90%,
well, 90%, it's the way everything is going to go the way we want it to go in terms of leadership, in terms of modeling. There's no argument about, oh my gosh, you know, that's a Confederate monument in the middle of town. Why, these black people complaining about Confederate, oh, forget it. It's not a big issue, right?
Won't ever change.
Right. Absolutely. You think now about people who raise that point about the monuments and having success, or you think about the presence of black politicians, which is an intriguing aspect of this book. Because remember, from the first movement, one of the great goals of the passage of the 65 Voting Rights Act was that black people would vote and could vote to elect black politicians who would do a better job of representing black interests in America. And the kind of great fruit of that effort would be Barack Obama. You have a black president. Well, the reason I say it's such an important aspect of this book, and I hope you'll pick it up, is that what you see is a lot of the activists, the black activists, are so disconcerted, so disappointed with Obama for saying he's not the black president, that he's the president of us all, and that he's looking to win election. He doesn't want to alienate moderate white voters. And so they feel like, well, wait a minute. If we finally have a black president, why isn't he speaking to our needs and our agenda more explicitly? But when he does, right from the start, I think it's 2009, when Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, has an incident with a white policeman in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Obama says, well, I think the police behaved stupidly in trying to stop a guy.
That stupid word was,
right,
was a
getting
big one.
into his own house. Oh my gosh. From my perspective as the journalist, what I saw was that his approval rating with whites went blah, right? They suddenly said, hey, I thought you were everybody's president. Well, all of a sudden, you're taking the black guy's side against the white cop. Same thing when Trayvon Martin is killed. Oh, Trayvon, if I had a son, would look like me. Oh, the whites said, wait a minute, why are you putting race on this? And wasn't Trayvon fighting with this guy and all the rest? You know.
Well, and basically, he was in a position where he got criticized from both ends, right?
Absolutely.
In other words, he wasn't being a black enough president for blacks,
right?
But he was being too black a president for retrenched whites.
I think that's exactly right, and that's why I write in the book, I think he's the most misunderstood president, because people who do what I do for a living, which is the journalism and the daily accounting, they look at policies, they look at response to crisis, they look at crisis management and the like, and they're judging him like that. And I'm saying, wait a second, he's the first black president. This is sort of an overarching lens that you have to understand to see the role he plays. And arguably, Terrence, when you look at the election of Trump in 16 and the election of Trump in 24, you're looking at the backlash to Obama. Exactly. And it's a racial backlash.
Right. Now, I will say, by the way, the one little nit I will pick is that my memory of the backlash is that the Tea Party begins over the way Obama was not hard enough on Wall Street.
Yes.
And that was not racial. That was across the board.
Right. In fact, people saying you're bailing out too big to fail Wall Street. You're not bailing out Main Street. That could be the white complaint, but the black complaint was, what about poor people? What about working class people? We're getting the wrong end of the stick here. We're getting shafted. You're not doing anything special to bail us out.
Right. And then I think the Affordable Care Act is one that, as we know so often, it's like you're helping them. You're going to take my tax dollars to help them.
I'm going to interview you, Terrence. Did you see that ad run by guess who in the last election in which he's talking about trans people? But the same language that you just heard from Terrence, she cares about they, them. He cares about you. That's the kind, we talk about the grievance, the racial, and in this case, the difference. In other words, those are different people. They're the people.
The other.
They're the people eating your pets, dude.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, was there a moment that you said, I got to write this book? Was there a certain thing that tipped the scales and you said, I mean, because a book is a big deal. It's a lot of work. When you said, I know what the next book is.
Well, I appreciate, let me say, the writer in me just fell in love with you, Terrence, because I think a lot of times, you come out here and here I have this book and you say, Juan's here, he's publicizing a book. And people say, well, what are you working on now? And I think, wait a minute, you don't understand. This takes your heart, man. This is so much work. So for me, this is 3 years plus of work. And I talked to you about having to persuade people. There's a movement going on. You have to persuade agents and publishers and editors to see the reality that to me is so striking that I've been describing to you today. And so it's a matter of, I'm not crazy. There's really history being made. And let me tell you, and then people say, oh, I get it. Okay, try it. It's like, try it. I got it. There's a factual case that's evident to me. Anyway, thank you for saying that, because it's an important book. This is my 10th book, for you, those of you who don't know me. So I started with Eyes on the Prize. You mentioned the biography of Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary. But it's, to me, the significance is not that I've written 10 books. The significance is that this book is so important in making the case that there is living history going on that so many people are indifferent to, even as they are in the very mix.
Well, one thing, when you said even today as we sit here, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, this movement is going on, I think in the background, because what people see is the backlash, because the backlash is now in the White House. DEI is banned. They couldn't, they had to take the plane that the Enola Gay, they had to take the picture out. And I mean, and just what they did recently with the Arlington ceremony,
Arlington
Cemetery, removing people of color's
also
things
women
on the website.
You can't
and
say
women.
That, you can't mention that there are women buried there.
Yeah. This is in
the
the last
federal
couple of
government
days.
has removed the word women from anything that is in a federal document or policy, including listing of prominent people buried at Arlington National Cemetery. This is
so what people
this sounds
see,
like a joke to me.
Yeah. What people see is the backlash. They don't see the movement going on behind the scenes.
Well, let me just put it to you in sort of focal terms that maybe people could focus on quickly, which is to say, I think we're living in a historical era in which the two major forces at play are Black Lives Matter and Make America Great Again. They are in conflict every day in every way, and you can see it in our politics, you can see it in our culture and arguments about cultural representation and even arguments about identity politics. It's stunning to me that people would say, oh, you know what, Terrence, you're engaged in identity politics. You say, what? Identity politics is not new to America. America has been a country of white identity and white male identity and land-owning white male identity for all time. But it's the new voices coming in and saying, wait, I have something to say about this. And they say, oh, you're playing identity politics. This, to me,
the biggest identity politician in the country is in the White House.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can't get away. But he's the one who then turns around and says, you're playing identity
politics. And one thing that I think you would not disagree with is that the intensity of the backlash is the evidence for the movement.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. It makes this book and my argument, it sounds self-serving, so excuse me if you feel this way, but to me, that is very much now how relevant, how topical this book is. This is what's going on right now. And so Trump, in his nefarious way, has made it very clear. There's a fight taking place.
That's right. If there weren't movement, if not a movement, if there weren't movement, there wouldn't be the intensity of the backlash. It wouldn't work. Now, what do you make of Trump's gains among Black and Latino, male especially, among Black and Latino voters in 2024?
Well, to me, this is part of what we were touching on earlier when I said that there was disappointment with Obama coming from Black, Latino, minority communities in terms of what they saw as his failure to be a president of color and speak out aggressively about racial issues. I think for a lot of them, the argument was, the establishment sucks. I don't want to be part of the establishment. And these politicians, they're all getting paid. They're all responding to some poll. They're not real. They're not authentic. And they don't have a genuine voice of concern for me and my issues. They're just playing me. Just playing me. And you saw that. I think that's why people turned off. And initially it was like, well, there's a black man running for president. How proud, how amazing in my lifetime. But once he's not running, once it's Hillary Clinton, now you see people back off. And you saw a drop in terms of voter turnout in 16. And then when you fast forward to 2020, you see it pick up again because George Floyd and all that. But then you come to 24, and I think you're seeing a different dynamic at play. Allow me to say this. I think that for a lot of those young black men and young Latino men, they're still saying, politics, the establishment, I don't want the status quo. I don't feel like, you know what, I'm making more money, or my schools in my neighborhood are better. I can still see what's going on with the cops in the neighborhood. I don't see that the status quo, so let's go for chaos and change, right? Okay, you know what, Trump is saying everything, let's go with that, right? But I think there's also some other levels to it, which is, for the young black and Latino men, they say, wait a minute, this guy's got a lot of women. He's walking around with these gold-headed women. He's got his name in gold letters on these buildings. He says he's a gold-laden billionaire, right? They say, well, this is like an OG, this is an old gangster type guy, you know, and he talks, he's bullying, you know, he says outrageous things and people are all reacting to him, you know. He's hanging out with Joe Rogan and the Ultimate Fighting people, right, and the wrestlers. You know what, and they've got him in trying to convict him of sexual assault of women, and oh my God, you know, so they say, remember Trump said his mugshot for the police, his photo, made him more popular with blacks. I don't think that's true. I think that was sort of a racist statement, in fact. But there's something about the ethos that he has created that is the defiant one.
Well, I mean, we've heard for decades, really, about when you don't see other options, the richest, toughest dope dealer becomes a role model. And in some sense, Trump is that same mold.
I think that's right. And you know, I think a lot of young people, but especially young men, in looking at Trump, I think you know, here we are in LA, let me just put it in cinematic terms. Instead of voting for Batman, they said, you know what, Gotham still has a lot of trouble. Why not vote for the Joker? Bring the Joker in and he's going to tear this joint up, right? And that's what we got.
At one point, I think you say Reconstruction was the first civil rights movement. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s is the second one, and what we're in the midst of now is the third one. But that first movement had a goal which was achievable. Which was, can we get the right to vote? Can we get desegregation of schools? Desegregation, once you've got schools, then you start going beyond that. And the expectation that was disappointed was, once we've got that, once we've got the vote, then the changes will show up in our lived experience.
Right.
And it's the lack of changes in the lived experience that, in some sense, the new movement is a backlash against the disappointment, and then there's the backlash against the second movement from the white side. So it's almost competing backlashes.
It is, and you know what I think in this moment, again, we keep coming back to March 17, 2025, but you know that there's a lot of upset right now among people who are identified as Democrats with Chuck Schumer and the Democrats for going along with the Republican effort to keep the government open with a terrible budget bill that grants Trump more power over the government. And then Schumer says, well, but if we did this, you know, he would then be able to shut down elements of the government on his own. It's like, wait a minute, why are the Democrats not more active? Why aren't they more engaged? Why don't they, you know, it's always like the Republicans, they come and they fight and they play dirty and they've got schemes, and the Democrats are like, well, we want to be the responsible, good people, and we want to be reasonable and, you know, take into considerations the feelings of others and worry about how the Trump base might react. Wait a minute, the Trump base doesn't care about how the people on the left feel or react or have a sense of being left behind. And so I think that for me, when I look at the Harris campaign, it's not that I think she ran a bad campaign, but I think she represented the status quo.
Right. Well, she was an incumbent because
Basically,
she was vice president.
And she wouldn't separate herself from Biden, right?
And it was right. And it's very clear he didn't want her to.
Right.
But I think that was her biggest liability. One of the things that occurs to me is that because this goes again to Trump's persona and all, he is so transgressive, so outside the box, that the Democrats, even though they want change, end up defending the status quo. They become the establishment by his outlaw behavior.
It's unbelievable to me. In other words, she ran a campaign in which she said, I'm not Trump. We're not going backwards. We're not going to invite a return to the chaos. You saw what he's done from the 16 to 20, and you know about the midnight tweets and the offensive language and the bullying and the racism, and so we're not going back. But for many people, it was like, well, that's the status quo, and he will change things up, you know? And so to my mind, she never caught the energy of the second movement. And here's what I'm trying to say. If she had said, oh yeah, we are going to be more pointed about going into neighborhoods that are ailing and do something about drug dealers or crime, right? We realize that cops may be a problem for some young black people, but guess what? There's a lot of black on black crime. That Juan Williams walking around his black neighborhood in Washington, D.C. realizes it's not the white cop that most likely will kill him. It's that 17-year-old with a gun who's looking to do something. And you say, wait a minute, why don't the politicians talk about that? Why don't they talk about the drug dealers? Why don't they talk about the schools? And we still have hyper-segregated schools in the majority of this country. And it's not just that they're hyper-segregated, it's that they are lower achieving schools. And that if you are a black child, a Latino child in those hyper-segregated schools, meaning they're 90% of children of color are in schools that are 90%.
That's right. So many things have not changed, and some have remarkably gotten worse.
So why don't the politicians talk about that?
Yeah. What is the prize? What is the new prize? And I'm going to put that two ways. What do you think this movement wants, and what will look like success?
Well, success varies. You know, I think that there is success when you think about someone like Stacey Abrams and her effort to halt voter suppression in the state of Georgia, and you see that the state of Georgia now has a Jewish senator and a black senator. I think there's success when you see that Joe Biden, when he was running in 2020, committed to having a black woman on the Supreme Court, and now you have Ketanji Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court. These are quantifiable success stories, in my opinion.
But do they speak to that lived experience feeling that you say the movement's motivated by?
I agree with you 100%. And I think that, again, when we come back to the 50% of Latino men, 25% of black men, I don't think that they say, oh, we got a black or Jewish senator. No, they say, what about my lived experience as you describe it? And they want people who are attending to those needs legitimately. So I think that that is a huge issue for the Democratic Party, getting real with people, speaking to that lived experience.
And how do you, and I think we're going to go to questions from you folks in just a second, but how do you, say you're waging a campaign, or you're just, nowadays I think in constant campaign mode in a way, but how do you say we've got to achieve the goals that blacks and Latinos need and want without alienating the whites? How do you make that statement that mass incarceration hurts everybody, housing problems hurt everybody, people fleeing the public school system hurts everybody?
Or demonizing immigrants hurts everybody. You know, I mean, I just stopped for a second and because, you know, Trump makes such an issue about immigrants as a burden on American society, the social safety net, even that they're taking jobs, or they're taking black jobs, you know.
Oh, right.
You know, remember what he said about those jobs are black jobs and all that. You know, and you stop and you think about, and they're eating people's pets.
Yes.
in Ohio. Remember, you demonize people in that way, and you stop and think about it. Wait a minute. America's experience is that we're a land of immigrants, and secondly, immigrants, in fact, contribute to the economy, to the economic growth, because they come in and they create consumption and demand.
And taxes.
I was going to say, it was my next point. They pay trillions in taxes and sometimes do not benefit from those taxes. You think about the percentage of patents in terms of inventiveness. It's almost half of the patents in this country come from people that weren't born in this country.
That's a remarkable statistic.
Right. So I could go on in this way, but you get the idea. Wait a minute. It's not that we should be afraid of these people who are being demonized by Trump, or, from the liberal perspective, pity these people. I think we should say, wait a second, this is a real positive for us as a country, as an American people, to have a legitimate immigration flow that supplements our economy and our culture. It has been it's like you talk about the stock market, and people say to you, just look at the stock market. Over time, it's clearly a good thing to put your money in the stock market. It's clearly a good thing for America, compared to all the other countries in the world, that we are the land of immigrants. But you wouldn't know it at this moment, because if you listen to the conversations, social media, but particularly to the political conversation, it's like they're either a burden or to be pitied rather than seen as a positive for our nation.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one last one, then turn to you. If you could step into the future 10 or 15 years from now, did we turn things around, and if so, how?
One of the failures of this second movement that I write about in New Prize for These Eyes is the failure to create political alliances that win elections. And we just barely managed it in 2020 when Biden beat Trump, did not manage it in 24. And I spoke to you about people on the left being dissatisfied and thinking Obama wasn't really speaking to their issues. They certainly didn't think Hillary was going to speak to their issues. And in the last instance, they didn't see Harris speaking to the real issues of what you called, I think really exactly right, Terrence, the lived experience of being a black person, or a Latino person, but specifically male person, minority in the country at this moment. I think in terms of a third movement turning a corner, it would be that suddenly people who are involved with, let's say, Black Lives Matter would say, oh, wait a second. If women in this country are concerned about reproductive rights, they're our allies. We have to be involved with them, and they have to be involved with us. If you are concerned in this country about larger issues having to do with immigration, and how, and let me just be clear here. It's not that all immigrants come from Latin countries. There are a lot of black immigrants. There are a lot of immigrants who come from Western Europe and Nordic countries.
And Asia.
And I was going to get, right. Yeah. That's, to me, wait a minute, why aren't they allies? And why aren't you saying, our politics have so much in common, we have to form a political alliance that will allow us to get our agenda satisfied. That to me is right now the prize. Can you create these alliances that will allow people to win elections? Because if you don't win elections, you get what we are experiencing. We keep coming back to March 17, 2025. And that's what we're going through, is the failure to win an election.
Right. And as we know, minority rule in the Constitution, Electoral College, Senate, and so on, the odds are stacked against, but it's got to be the goal.
Mr. Williams, what is with this issue of wanting to purge our history and not talk about our history?
As you can imagine, for me, this is so personal, and it comes down to what I view as propaganda. And it comes down, and again, touches me in terms of book banning. Now, I write about race. That's been the majority of the books that I've written touch on this subject, race relations and racial equity in America. But you should know, most of the book bans have to do with sex and gays, and have to do with people who are viewed as somehow different. You pick up on your language, Terrence. I mean, they even, they wanted to ban a book on Willie Mays. They wanted to ban a book on Roberto Clemente. Why? Because in the books they talk about the racial difficulties that these athletic superstars faced in the course of their careers. So we're talking about not allowing young people to hear these stories, and that's why I say it strikes me as propagandistic. But the argument would be, oh, a young white person hears this and they feel guilty, or they feel bad, or they feel less patriotic, less proud to be an American. And to me, this is ridiculous. We are the American people. This is our story. This is our family story. It's like saying, oh, we've got a crazy uncle and we shouldn't ever talk about him.
Yeah, it makes me say, who's the snowflake here?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Oh boy, cancel culture. You opened a new box.
And they want to cancel history.
Why doesn't the religious, the evangelicals and the religious vote line up with this new movement?
This is a very important question, but I think that what you know is that the evangelical movement's, largely based in the South, is overwhelmingly white, and their attitudes towards racial issues is just fraught with racism and exclusion, and also speaks to a lot of very right-wing attitudes with regard to abortion rights and with regards to education. Some of these topics we were just talking about, like a book ban, a book that talks about somebody who has sexuality that's somewhere on the spectrum between absolutely male and absolutely female, certainly someone who is a transgender person. They just see this as alarming and not something that should be real. So they identify their interest, their lived experience, as being counter to the left, and not even, and again, this is so outrageous to me, and not in line with, wait a minute, what about your values? What about the way that women are treated? What about the idea of family that you say you celebrate, that family is so important? Look at this guy and how he's handled family, and look at his history, right? Or at this moment, we keep coming back to March 17, 2025, who's threatening Medicare? Who's threatening Medicaid? Who's threatening Social Security, arguably so that a huge tax cut can pass for the super rich, for the increasing number of oligarchs in the United States? But I agree with the spirit of your question. Why aren't the religious conservatives turning their backs on Trump?
Let me recommend to you and all of you a documentary called Bad Faith. Bad Faith. It is the history of the Christian nationalist movement, and it's really eye-opening when someone tracks it from the start. But I would just say that is about power more than it's about Jesus, more than it's about morals, more than it's about your fellow man.
Well, I mean, you go back, the history of religion in the country is that, either the blacks were upstairs or not allowed in the building, and what Dr. King called the most segregated hour in American life, 11 a.m. on Sunday morning.
Right. And religion was used actually a justification for slavery.
Absolutely.
As you said, March 17th, 2025, and things I could never have imagined are happening all around us. What do we do?
Well, I feel your pain. It's a stumper. At the moment, you can see with Schumer, his decision is let Trump go and hope that people see Trump's excesses for what they are and start to turn. And the argument would be, as Trump's poll numbers go down, and specifically go down in red districts and MAGA districts, that then you could see Republicans in the House and Senate who have so far been absolutely compliant to whatever Trump demands, that they might start to say, hey, our interests are separate from Trump's. So you see people like AOC, Bernie Sanders, Tim Walz now campaigning in red areas of the country and saying, we're going to have these town hall meetings that the Republicans won't have because they don't want to hear the protests coming from their own voters against Trump. But that's a start. And the spirit of your question is, what can we do? And to me, the argument requires us to have some understanding that the Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It's not like we can turn anything on a dime here. But it's also the case that we should not lose heart, and we should not think, oh, our silence is all that we can do. We're just roadkill. No. It's so important, again, to me, to understand the moment in history, to understand all that rides on it, and that we have voice, and that we should raise our voices and not give up.
And I'm going to pitch some organizations, if you don't know about them already. Indivisible, okay? Our Revolution, started by Bernie Sanders' campaign. And there is a wonderful, a woman who puts out a daily what to do thing named Jessica Craven, and it's called Chop Wood, Carry Water. And if you look at those three, they'll give you, and Third Act for people over 60. So if you look at those four, you'll have plenty to do.
Thank you for being here. I really have a lot of respect for your historical perspective and your thoughtfulness. Just a quick preface, I worked in communities of color for about 20 years. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. And so I was on the gun violence prevention movement, as it were, in communities of color. And I found, that issue was dealt with very differently in white communities and black communities, and it bothered me a lot. So I got involved, and I was in the room for a lot of these conversations about the disappointment in President Obama. And now today, in some of those same circles, in some of those rooms where I'm listening, the top tier concern, one of them, is the attack on Social Security. Right. This is the livelihood and lifeblood for so many members of these communities. And I'm just looking for recommendations to pass along on how to fight that particular battle, to salvage, protect Social Security, which is so essential for the health and well-being of communities of color.
Wow, I think it's so important for beyond communities of color, disproportionately given income levels for those communities of color. But the fact is, it's so important for people who are white and any color, and I would say especially for women who are more likely to be widowed than widower or male, and even for the disabled and for children of people who have been disabled or dead, This is American concern. And so to me, it should be that you can form political alliances on this basis. The difficulty is, I think on the far right, in terms of the conservative media echo chamber, it's always positioned as it's helping those people, not you, not me. It's not us. And us could be, definitely white as opposed to black or Latino or working class or whatever. But the fact is, it hurts so many people across racial and political lines. And the difficulty is that those people are so locked into what I think of as almost cult-like thinking that until it hits them, they will not be willing to stand up and scream bloody murder. And I think that that day is coming. Because if you look at what Elon Musk is doing, in order to achieve those ends, they've got to cut into Social Security and the other social safety net programs.
And I would add, I think when Republicans are in power, whether it's because they have an administration or majorities in the Congress, they go after Social Security. They have never succeeded yet. One of the charms, or not the charms, one of the brilliant strategies of Social Security is that it isn't means tested. It's everyone. Same with Medicare. Everyone. That helps. But here's the thing. There are very intelligent people who do not know that there's a cap on Social Security taxation, right? The cap this year is $176,100. $176,000, anywhere up to there, you get 100% Social Security collected against. If you make $1 million, you're only getting Social Security against 17%. You make $2 million, it's less than that. And I think if you want to save Social Security, get on your hobby horse about the cap and tell people, yes, we need change, but that's the change we need. Raise the cap so that Elon Musk is paying Social Security taxes on billions and not just on the first 176.
Thanks for a very engaging conversation. Enjoyed it. And we're from Brooklyn. We're born around the same time.
Yeah.
What neighborhood are you from?
Crown Heights.
Crown Heights, me too. St. John's Place.
Wow, I knew that very well. Yeah.
Excellent.
So,
By the way, since we're in LA, I should point out, part of my teenage years were spent in Ebbets Field, the first home of the Dodgers.
and I went skating at the Empire Roller Drome.
There you go, right on Empire Boulevard. Yeah.
Okay, so you, in a short moment, you talked about the BLM and another faction, I think it was women and abortion, should unite. You reminded me of something Obama said. I read about him saying it, I didn't hear the speech, where he opened a talk in front of a Democratic organization. I want to dispel the rumor that Democrats don't believe in anything. The fact is, Democrats believe in anything. And the trouble that I see in these organizations and these movements is they can never find a unified path to work together, to build a critical mass with all of their ideas. Do you think that that is a function of not having a charismatic leader?
Well, in American media, and we're, special social media, having an identifiable leader is very much a plus. And I think that's what Trump is for that far-right MAGA movement. They have an identifiable leader. But to my mind, it's not just the absence of a singular leader. It's the sense that you've got to win elections. And when people say, well, why should you have these alliances, people who are concerned about immigration rights, people who are concerned about abortion rights, people who are concerned about mass incarceration, bad schools, income inequality, I can keep going, it's like a buffet. You say, well, wait, but I want some of this and some of that, not that. No, you got to get people to say, but if we all come together and create a whole picture here, it allows us to advance each of these agendas. And currently, each of these agendas is losing or being silenced. So it's in the interest of everyone here to see the power of collective action. And that's the argument that I think that I'm trying to make here tonight.
An expression I use over and over again is the common good. And every one of those things in that buffet comes together to serve the common good.
Right.
And the other side is about the billionaires who sat behind him on inauguration.
Or they claim to be populist, and I don't know how you get away with it. I mean, to me, it's like, wow, people are lying, and somehow people close their, we were talking before about the evangelicals, you got to close your eyes to the idea that the man was found guilty of sexual assault. I don't get it.
I know.
The earlier civil rights movement and what you're calling the second civil rights movement, something very different about the two is the use of social media.
Right.
In my mind, as the questioner says, I feel it is not helping in this current social second movement. How can that change?
And by the way, there's a lot in the book about social media.
It is a
we
very
didn't talk
important,
about it, but there's a lot in the book. But take
very
the question.
Important element. So again, thinking in terms of first movement, second movement, and people thinking, well, maybe this is just the first movement, transitioning in a different time. we talked about the agenda, the first movement's agenda, passing civil rights laws to protect the idea that constitutional rights should be enforced for all people without regard to race, gender, and the like. But part of this comes down to, and the previous question about, identifiable leader. In the first case, when you have a Dr. King or a Whitney Young, a Roy Wilkins, even a John Lewis at SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, those guys come out with an agenda. They go to the big papers or the 3 networks that existed at the time, and if they get an audience, if they get some reception, then all of a sudden everybody says, that's the agenda, those are the leaders, this is why we're having a march on X date to do such and such and get it done. Today, in terms of mass media, it is social media. It's the way that Black Lives Matter was created by people who were not in Florida where Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted by a jury, but were in Oakland, California, and who get online and say, the kid is walking down the street. He doesn't have the gun. He's just carrying, I think, Skittles and iced tea, and someone views him as a threat, engages with him, starts a fight with him, and then kills him, and somehow that man is acquitted, and Black lives, that child's life mattered, Black lives matter. That is the power of social media in this moment. And you can see that when it comes to those marches that took place after George Floyd was killed, that so much of the organizing, it was sort of organic in terms of social media. It wasn't that there was an organized group, Black Lives Matter, centrally doing the organizing of these thousands of marches around the country. It was people online saying, we're getting together, we're doing this, and then the permits and all the rest taking place. I might add here that it's also the case that the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the guys who are the KKK, which has endorsed Trump, if you'll recall, they're also online. They're also driving people down into the rabbit holes with their algorithms that say, if you're interested in using the N-word and cursing out women and, the whole Steve Bannon and the video games that appeal to so many of the young men, they use that kind of thinking to appeal on a political basis for their attention and then their passion and get them to lock in to Trump. This is a different era in terms of how the narrative, the story is told, because of where the story is told. It's not that the 3 networks are somehow turned and not telling the story. It's that most people are now getting their news from TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, right? It goes on. That's where the game is being played, and arguably, the game is being played better by the right wing.
Well, one thing I was going to say is that they seem to always be just a step ahead.
Yeah.
In other words, Trump had it in 2016 with using Analytica from the UK,
Yes.
and Bannon and those folks were just ahead. And this time, they went to the Manosphere podcasts,
Yes.
while the Democratic candidate was edging into that territory, but not going full force. I mean, one thing that I do believe is a real big factor in this election. According to what I've read, 70 million people listened to Trump on Rogan. 70 million. And I'm picturing a guy who had no intention of voting. And one of his bros said, you hear Trump on Rogan? And he goes, no, well, it's available, right? It's not like a one-time thing. He goes, he listens for 10 minutes, and he says, shit, I didn't know they were that bad. I didn't know they were going to do that. And he decides to vote. And enough people do that in those few swing states, and there goes your election.
Well, I think this is part of the challenge of this moment, is figuring out how to deal with this. I find that people on the right wing, these people all say, oh, there's this elite left-leaning media and the universities. We're seeing that even now. And I always think to myself, well, what's the biggest newspaper in the country? Oh, it's the Wall Street Journal, right? I think about, oh, what about all these talk shows? Oh, and you think, well, wait a minute. Even the talk shows that are on terrestrial radio, they dominate. NPR and Pacifica exist, but they don't compete with all the legacy of Rush Limbaugh in terms of that right-wing talk
And Sinclair
radio.
Broadcasting.
And I could go on. So to me, you got to say, well, wait a second, I think, and by the way, those people are always saying, don't listen to the left-wing media, right? Don't trust the big newspapers. Don't trust the networks. They don't, and don't trust even Twitter and Facebook. That's why, remember, Musk buys Twitter, because
right,
they're
they keep
trying to
moving further out.
censor
Yeah.
the right way. It's just madness. And yet they put this out there and people buy it. And if you hear it often enough, you say, oh, well, yeah, I guess that's right. They're trying to censor conservative thought. In fact, when I look at social media and I look at the impact it has on our children, and especially our young women in terms of sexual messages, envy, jealousy, trivia, I am shocked. This is poison into the minds of our young people.
Yeah.
And not regulated. We regulate, the FCC regulates the broadcast networks. Nobody regulates
And Trump
those people.
and the gang that stood behind him at the inauguration, they ran on not regulating tech.
Exactly. And, you know, how can that be in the interest of our great nation? I just don't see it.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Terrence.
Again, the book is New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. And you can find Juan's latest commentaries. I'm going to give you a long URL here at thehill, one word, .com/opinion/columnists, plural, /Juan-Williams. thehill.com/opinion/columnist/Juan-Williams. This episode was recorded as a Live Talks LA in-person event, March 17th, 2025 in Los Angeles. I've had the pleasure of participating in conversations for them many times over the years, including with Michael Lewis, Yuval Noah Harari, T-Bone Burnett, and you can learn more about their past and future events at livetalksla.org. That's all one word, livetalksla.org, and link to this conversation by going to youtube.com/livetalksla/videos and scroll down till you find it. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. terrencemcnally.net is TERRENCEMCNALLY.net. And the other is aworldthatjustmightwork, all one word.com. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and links to 10 or 15 articles to flesh out the conversation, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, @mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on Apple Podcasts and most of those other podcast sites. You can find years of podcasts at my site or at most podcast sites. Archives include Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle, George Packer, Doris Kearns Goodwin. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Live Talks LA and Ted Hoptegaber, and to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely.